So, yes, you don't remember the Roaring Twenties, but what's interesting is you remember something about the Roaring Twenties because your parents or grandparents lived through it. And of course, there's a lot of uh, stuff on television, movies, either about or set in the 20s, and popular fiction, and you name it. Uh, and I'll be talking about some of those things that sort of bubbled up from a creative standpoint during the Roaring Twenties and are still very much with us today in one form or another. So here is a question I'm going to put to you about the Roaring Twenties. But first, let's think about life today. Life in America, the year 2020. We enjoy the benefits of life-changing technology. At the same time, people of a certain age, like you and I, are sometimes annoyed by children with their loose morals, their crazy music, their silly fads. Some of us are worried about real threats to social order, from crime and corruption, from disloyal immigrants, and from the abuse of illegal substances. And as well, some of us have been enjoying a pretty good run in the stock market until all of a sudden we didn't. So if all that sounds like today, it's also true of the Roaring Twenties, when I can wake up my slides here. Oops. When America went wild. So that's our topic today, Roaring Twenties. This is a G-rated version of life in the Roaring Twenties. So I don't know if any of you have your flapper skirts with you. You might want to save those. We'll have an opportunity to do some impromptu performance at the end with my final video clip. Anyway, let's talk about the 20s. 100 years ago, the Roaring Twenties. 6 months before the Roaring Twenties began, the Versailles Treaty officially ended World War I. That was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Troops came marching home, as these troops here, marching down lower Manhattan in New York City, came marching home from the flesh pots of France. They had relaxed attitudes, cynical, a bit of sophistication. They wanted to find comforts and amusements to put the horrors of the trenches behind them. And Americans in general, even here on the home front, saw that international tension was continuing after the war, and all of those pious ideals that led America into the war in 1917 seemed to be not panning out as we had hoped. And so in a world in which all of our uncertainties have been overthrown, world problems are just too difficult to face, Americans are tired of sacrifice. They want to return to a pleasant pre-war life, something called normalcy. And they got it with the two presidents in the 1920s. Photograph on the left, March 1921, shows President Wilson on the left, now sick, quite sick. His dreams of world peace have been shattered by the defeat of the League of Nations in the Senate. He'd been a dogmatic president, lecturing America on its global responsibilities. Now he's succeeded by the individual on the right. In the top hat, Warren G. Harding, very different character. A small town newspaper publisher from Ohio, handsome. He certainly looked the part of a president, congenial, sociable, like a kindly old uncle. And unlike Wilson, Harding was not going to ask much sacrifice of the American people. He was not a particularly deep thinker. One commentator at the time said, his speeches give the impression of an army of pompous phrases moving over the landscape in search of an idea. Well, he was not much of a speaker. He was politically inept, surrounded himself with corrupt, incompetent cronies, spent evenings at the White House in all-night booze and poker sessions, even after Prohibition. The Republican Party paid off his mistresses while his ambitious wife looked the other way. Photograph on the left shows, or the illustration shows, one of his most famous scandals. His Interior Secretary went to jail for bribery over oil leases on naval oil reserves out west, and that was sort of characteristic of the flavor of his administration. He died in 1923. Harding's wife refused an autopsy and burned all his private papers. There were rumors that she poisoned him to avoid the disgrace of his many affairs. He's succeeded by Silent Cal Coolidge from Vermont, 1923, a paragon of Yankee modesty and rectitude. He hated pomp and spectacle. This photograph, taken during a campaign stop on an Indian reservation, shows Coolidge about as expressive as he ever got. He said of himself, I quote, "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know that he is not a great man." He had no illusions of greatness. He believed in a small federal government with a hands-off policy towards banks and corporations. He most famously said, "The business of America is business." And he reinforced his cool, complacent attitude by napping for 2 to 4 hours every day. Man after my own heart. Well, while Coolidge slept, the economy chugged along, presided over a period of low inflation, low interest rates. Industrial productivity and wages increased during the 20s, early in the 20s. Taxes and government debt reduced, no surprise there. But not everybody benefited from the booming economy. Farmers, coal miners, and black sharecroppers faced worsening conditions as the 20s went along, and naturally, very few workers made it into the ranks of the rich. But most people believed they might have a shot at prosperity at least. And along the way, they could enjoy a lifestyle that was being steadily transformed for the better. In the 1920s, Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world. Ford's Model T on the left brought cars within the reach of everyone's budget. The number of autos on the roads tripled during the 1920s. Cars gave Americans unprecedented mobility, of course, but also new recreational opportunities and new housing options in the growing suburbs around the urban core cities. And homemakers, like that young lady on the right, could buy the latest labor-saving appliances on easy credit. Electric washers, vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators, like the one she's got there, revolutionized domestic life. Amid the booming economy, prospects were especially bright for the young. Post-war cynicism fueled a rejection of traditional values. Young people now had the money to express themselves in new and outrageous ways. In olden days, young men were supposed to be gallant, serious, hardworking. Now, as you can see in the old Life magazine cover on the left, they put on baggy pants, they slicked back their hair, and they wooed their girlfriends in public parks. Probably can't read the fine print. The title on that illustration is Petting Green. I'll leave that to your imagination. Women, young women, like the woman shown in the Life magazine cover, had been brought up to be prim and modest. Now they hiked up their skirts, rolled down their stockings, and bobbed their hair. Sometimes they wore unbuckled galoshes, shown there on the left, which flapped when they walked, which may have given rise to the term flappers. But the word flappers more likely relates to the flapping arms, like a chicken, when young people danced the Charleston. The mood of the young people of the 1920s captured in a musical clip I'm going to play for you. Just runs about 30 seconds or so. And by the way, on your devices, you might want to take note of where the volume control is in case you have to adjust it a little bit. But I'm going to play for you an excerpt from a song from the 1920s entitled "Let's Misbehave." And it has the wonderful lyric, "We're all alone, no chaperone, let's be outrageous."
We're all alone, no chaperone can get our number. The world's in slumber, let's misbehave. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous, let's misbehave.
Well, no doubt young women outraged polite society with their relaxed attitudes and their unconventional behavior. In Chicago, photograph on the right shows a young woman who was taken to the police station in a paddy wagon for showing too much skin in public. Cigarette sales doubled in the 1920s as women took up smoking as a sign of style and a way to keep a slim figure. It was thought. Of course, they couldn't smoke in public. Photograph on the left shows two women having a smoke in the smoking lounge on a railroad train. They were banned from smoking in the dining room or dining car like the male passengers, so they had to sneak off to the smoking lounge. The number of beauty shops quadrupled in the 20s, reflecting a new obsession with appearance and the fact that women who joined the workforce during and after World War I had disposable income to spend on themselves. Ads for cosmetics stoked a trend of spending to appease one's vanity, elevate one's sex appeal. Look at that advertisement there at the bottom. Maybelline promises that you too can have eyes that charm. Well, despite all the hullabaloo over sexy, liberated women, most women in the 20s actually settled down to perfectly traditional marriages and family life. And they could vote. By 1870, women were already voting in state elections out west, but it took another 70 years of struggle to win a universal right for women to vote in national elections. During the Wilson administration, this was quite controversial. A photograph shows some women picketing the White House, and the other photograph shows a male organized group called the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And you'll note also it says that's the headquarters. So I don't know that they had very many members, but they were certainly proudly advertising their anti-women attitude, or anti-women suffrage, I should say. As late as 1912, in the New York Times, we think of the New York Times today as a beacon of liberal opinion. In 1912, the newspaper had an editorial that said with suffrage, women would be making impossible demands, such as, and I quote, serving as soldiers and sailors, police patrolmen, or firemen, and women would serve on juries and elect themselves to executive offices and judgeships. Perish the thought. Well, finally, with the approval by the Tennessee legislature, the 19th Amendment did take effect August 18th, 1920. Well, numerous commentators were, again, as I say, concerned about the attitudes of young people. Here's a wonderful quote from the president of a university in Florida. He said, "The low-cut gowns that women are wearing, the rolled hose, the short skirts, are born of the devil and his angels, and are carrying the present and future generations to chaos and destruction." Well, if you're going to go to perdition, at least you'd have some sweet music take you along the way, and that, of course, is jazz. Jazz is a distinctly American musical form. It emerged at the end of the 19th century in the brothels and dance halls of Black New Orleans, moved up the Mississippi River to Kansas City, Memphis, Chicago, finally reached New York in the 20s, took the country by storm. Even old dogs wanted to learn new tricks from flappers. There's another cover of the old Life magazine showing an old dog having a gay old time with his charming young companion. Like the 20s itself, jazz was fast and freewheeling, urban, sophisticated, youthful. One contemporary critic complained that jazz stimulates half-craized barbarians to the vilest of deeds. Use your imagination. Well, the word jazz, after all, was an African-American slang term for sex. But the noted composer Leopold Stokowski recognized jazz as, quote, an expression of the breathless, energetic times in which we are living. It is useless to fight against it. One of the greatest jazz musicians of all time was Louis Armstrong. In the 1920s, before he gained fame as a solo artist, he played in Chicago with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, shown here. So I'll play a short excerpt. You can see what all the excitement was about. This is a short excerpt, an original recording of Lewis and Company playing the Snake Rag. Well, in 1924, jazz got cleaned up a bit, mixed in with classical music idiom in George Gershwin's groundbreaking hit, Rhapsody in Blue. Listen to the opening notes of the Rhapsody in Blue, the wailing clarinet, a new sound that hits concert halls across America. Well, that's a classical take on jazz. If you wanted the real thing, the place to go in New York, at least, was Harlem, where Black venues like the Cotton Club, which were open to white audiences only, gave the idle rich a chance to escape their dull, respectable lives downtown. Take a listen to Bessie Smith, Queen of the Blues, the highest paid Black star of the 20s, earning $1,500 a week in 1924. She toured the country in a two-story Pullman railroad car. And in this song, she's looking for a good man to cure the blues. And the somewhat risque title of this selection is I Need a Little Sugar in My Bowl. Here's Bessie Smith.
Tired of being lonely, tired of being blue. I wished I had some good man to tell my troubles to.
Well, while wealthy New Yorkers went slumming uptown, lower class Americans all over the country were flocking to the movies. An advertisement that appeared in the mid-1920s explained why. I quote, all the adventure, all the romance, all the excitement you lack in your daily life are in pictures. They take you completely out of yourself into a wonderful new world, out of the cage of everyday existence, if only for an afternoon or an evening of escape. Well, people could get their daily dose of fantasy in the huge gaudy theaters that went up all over the country. There's one shown on the left with a fake audience reaction, but nevertheless, the rest of it is quite lifelike. These theaters were modeled after French palaces, Chinese pagodas, Greek temples. They featured gilded staircases, 30-piece orchestras, or at the very least, a pipe organ or a piano, as the one here. One star created in the 1920s is shown on the screen. Rudolph Valentino, the ultimate sex symbol of the silver screen. He appeared in more than 30 films before dying of a post-operative infection at age 31, 1926. His funeral drew 100,000 mourners into the streets of New York. The hottest female star of the 20s was Clara Bow on the right. She was the it girl. She had it. And I guess that meant sex appeal. The expression they could not name, but that's what she had. Interesting life she led. She grew up as a tomboy in a poor Brooklyn neighborhood, rose to become Hollywood's top box office draw in 1928, the ripe old age of 23. Like a lot of silent film stars, she had trouble adapting to talking pictures. Her thick Brooklyn accent may have hurt her career, and at age 28, she retired from acting, moved to her husband's ranch in Nevada. Well, vamps like her and Latin lovers weren't the only stars of the movies in the 1920s. You also had cowboys and swashbucklers. Both of these figures I'm going to talk about briefly have Pennsylvania connections, interestingly enough. Tom Mix on the left, born in Pennsylvania, born up in Cameron County, defined the Western movie genre. And on the right, in the Zorro mask from a movie appropriately entitled The Mask of Zorro, is Douglas Fairbanks, King of Hollywood. His father was born in northern Dauphin County, a little place called Barrysburg. Not even sure it's on the map anymore today, but these are two examples of the many movie stars that filled the silent screen in the 20s. And of course, there were comedians as well. Charlie Chaplin played off his tough London childhood by creating the character of the tramp, naive but hopeful. This is a still from his classic movie, The Gold Rush. His films combine slapstick with pathos, offering insight into human relationships that allow us to survive adversity with dignity and passion. Harold Lloyd, on the right, had no deeper meaning. His movies were just funny. They featured extended chase scenes, daredevil stunts, and trick shots, like this one from Safety Last, where he appears to be suspended from a clock above the streets of New York City. Harold Lloyd's individual films were not as successful as Chaplin's, but he made a lot more of them, and he actually became the highest paid film star in the 1920s. Well, eventually movies began to become talkies, even though one studio executive, Harry Warner, reportedly said, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" Well, evidently a lot of people did, hence the advent of talking pictures. The first one is considered to be The Jazz Singer from 1927. There's a lobby card there on the left. This was the first feature film that had synchronized music and some dialogue, some singing. Features Al Jolson as the ambitious son of a Jewish cantor in New York City. And I happened to see this movie on Turner Classic Movies a few months ago, and it's a bit odd because most of it is silent. But every now and then, as for example, when Al Jolson or the jazz singer serenades his mother here, suddenly we can hear music, we can hear singing and dialogue for a short time. On the right is Steamboat Willie from 1928, the first animated cartoon with synchronized sound. Walt Disney, who created the cartoon, really created the cartoon industry to a large degree, was quite a visionary, and he saw the future of the business in sound. So Steamboat Willie marks the debut of Mickey Mouse and his girlfriend Minnie Mouse. The character may have been inspired by a pet mouse in the Disney household. Walt reportedly wanted to name the mouse Mortimer, but his wife thought that was a little bit too pompous, so they settled on Mickey. And Walt Disney himself, by the way, did all the voices in these early cartoons. Well, Steamboat Willie became the most popular cartoon of all time, and I'll let you see just a little bit of it now. Well, I encourage you to take a look at the whole cartoon if you can find it on YouTube. You will find it on YouTube, and very often what you'll find are actually edited versions. The original, not politically correct. It features characters chewing and spitting tobacco. It shows animal cruelty. At one point, Mickey swirls a cat around by the tail. On another occasion, he squeezes a duck, playing it like a set of bagpipes. But a really fascinating curiosity in the entertainment world. Well, athletic competition, like the movies, was an area where top performers could win wealth and fame in the 20s. Aggressive promotion, colorful personalities, and record-setting crowds made this a golden age of sports. Exhibit A is Jack Dempsey. He grew up in Colorado, brawling in bar rooms and mining camps and hobo jungles. His savage style of fighting earned him the nickname the Manassas Mauler, not from Manassas, Virginia, but from Manassas, Colorado, where he grew up. He reigned for 7 years as heavyweight champ in the 20s, partied with movie stars and politicians. His popularity in and out of the ring landed him on the cover of Time magazine in 1923, there on the left. His career ended in 1927 after two historic losses to Gene Tunney, both of them on points. He was not knocked out. His first loss, he famously explained away by telling his wife, "Honey, I forgot to duck." You remember that as the line that Ronald Reagan came up with after his assassination attempt on his life many years ago. After that match, there was a rematch, also against Gene Tunney, drew the first $2 million gate in entertainment history. 50 million people listened on radio, and Dempsey lost after the controversial long count shown there on the right photograph. Gene Tunney had extra time to rest on the mat after Dempsey knocked him down. But there were no hard feelings afterwards. Later on, Dempsey campaigned for Gene Tunney's son, John Tunney, when he ran for the U.S. Senate in 1970. The greatest baseball player of the 20s, and maybe of all time, was George Herman Ruth, also known as Babe Ruth, also known as the great Bambino, the Sultan of SWAT, shown on the right. He drank, he chased women, he was a troublemaker, bent the training rules, but fans loved him, and so did the press, made him one of the most photographed people in the world. His lifetime total of 714 home runs stood for 40 years until Hank Aaron passed him in 1973. On the left is Harold Red Grange, also known as the Galloping Ghost. He gave a huge boost to professional football in the 20s. He also is a Pennsylvania native, born in Forksville, up north, had an outstanding career as a halfback at the University of Illinois. In the most famous 12 minutes of football history, at least at the college level, he scored 4 touchdowns for the end of the first quarter in a game against Michigan, 1924. After he graduated from Illinois, he said, "I don't like football enough to play it for free." So he went on to play a few years with the Chicago Bears, retired as a millionaire. Here's another famous athlete from the 1920s, less well known, Gertrude Ederle. In 1926, she became the first woman to swim the English Channel, and she beat the men's record by almost 2 hours. She's shown there on the right, smothered in grease to ward off some of the cold in the channel. Her time across the channel, by the way, was 14 hours and 31 minutes. Afterwards, when she returned to the US, she was honored in a ticker tape parade in Manhattan, shown on the left, drew 2 million cheering spectators. Her athleticism defined the new woman of the 20s, but her wholesome lifestyle, at the same time, won her praise from President Coolidge. Normally silent, Cal referred to her as America's best girl. Well, the 20s spawned a lot of celebrities and a genuine hero too, Charles Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle. Began his flying career as an Army aviator, a barnstormer, airmail pilot. Then he got wind of a $25,000 prize for the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris. He gets a group of St. Louis business executives to underwrite his attempt. He designs a custom single-engine fabric-covered aircraft. Shown on the left, it was dubbed the Spirit of St. Louis in honor of his benefactors. It carried 450 gallons of gas, but not much else. To save weight, it had no radio, no fuel gauges, and no parachute. But it had a real star in the cockpit. Lindbergh's all-American spunk, his boyish good looks, made him a natural focus of press attention. The night before his historic flight, he was kept awake in his hotel room by a mob of card-playing reporters. The next day, he embarked on his 33.5-hour flight across the Atlantic, sometimes no more than 10 feet above the surface of the water. He was dogged by hallucinations, spells of semi-consciousness. When he landed, shown there on the right, he was shocked to find 150,000 people swarming the airfield to greet him. The adulation continued back home. He went on a 3-month tour of the country, giving patriotic speeches, promoting commercial aviation, and dodging marriage proposals. Later, his reputation suffered a bit. He was a fan of Nazi Germany, but he redeemed himself after the US entered the war by serving as a civilian, flying combat missions in the Pacific Theater as a technical advisor to aircraft manufacturers. Well, hero worship coexisted with some of the craziest fads and follies during the 1920s. The crossword puzzle had been invented a few years before, in 1913, by an English journalist at the New York World, but it went into syndication in the 20s, became a nationwide phenomenon. To help avid fans, the B&O Railroad provided dictionaries on trains, or you could buy this tiny dictionary to strap to your wrist. In 1924, Simon & Schuster published its first book. It was a book of crossword puzzles. Well, crossword puzzles are still popular. I don't think people are playing mahjong as much anymore. There's a photograph on the right. That was quite a fad, imported from China, and often involved dressing up in silks and other props in kind of a faux Chinese atmosphere. Entered the US 1922, and I know it's found, among other things, on the game suite on computers, but some folks still play mahjong, even though the rules are famously inscrutable. Flagpole sitting got a start with an ex-Navy steelworker and stuntman named Alvin Shipwreck Kelly on the left. He got started in this crazy business in 1924 in Hollywood. Where else? When a movie theater hired him to climb up on a pole to draw crowds. He stayed there for 13 hours, and the popularity took off. His own personal best as a flagpole sitter was 49 days. I'm sure they come down periodically for rest breaks. An Iowa man pushed the limit to 51 days before the fad finally died out at the end of the decade. Dance marathons on the right augmented this kind of exhibitionism with a touch of sadism. Spectators flocked to see dancers compete for small cash prizes or a few moments of fame. Periodic breaks were allowed, but the pair had to keep moving on the dance floor or they would be disqualified. The record for endurance was 119 days, but you would not come anywhere near that if, as often happened, a rival would slip you a dose of laxative or sleeping pills. A much more pleasant form of exhibition was launched in Atlantic City in 1921. The Miss America pageant began as a promotional scheme to keep tourists in Atlantic City after Labor Day. It also held out the promise of taking an ordinary, good-looking American girl and making her a celebrity, very much in the spirit of the 20s. The first year's contest only drew 8 contestants. The winner was a high school junior from Washington, D.C., Margaret Gorman. She won $100, a trophy, and if I can judge that photograph closely, the key to the city. Now, the Miss America pageant had its critics from the beginning. The YWCA declared, quote, "The notoriety is unsettling. The girls are exposed to grave dangers from unscrupulous persons. The shocking costumes, which such contests encourage, certainly call for protests from organizations interested in girls' welfare." Well, Miss Gorman didn't think much of the idea either. "Wasn't my idea," she said later on. "I really want to forget the whole thing." But when she died in 1995, she still owned the dress shown in the photograph, sea green chiffon with sequins. Not every trend of the 20s was frivolous. Immigrants faced growing suspicion out of fear that radical movements in Europe at the end of World War I might take hold in America. That concern struck hard in the case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were admitted anarchists, originally from Italy. They avoided service in World War I. They were accused of murdering 2 men during a payroll robbery at a Massachusetts shoe factory in 1920. They were convicted on dubious evidence, sentenced to death, which sparked international protests. And you see some protesters holding signs on the left. Appeals dragged on for years. They were finally executed in 1927, but as new evidence came to light, doubts about the verdict persist today. And while they were undergoing their legal troubles, changes in federal immigration law in the 1920s severely restricted immigration from Italy and Eastern Europe. And those restrictions remained, for the most part, national immigration policy until 1965. Another ominous trend in the 20s was the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in the South during Reconstruction, it had largely died out by the early 20th century. It revived in the 20s, though, due to two main factors. Number one was the phenomenal success of Birth of a Nation, 1915 silent film that romanticized the Klan. It was reportedly President Wilson's favorite movie. The other factor that sparked a rise in the Klan was backlash against undesirables who were becoming increasingly visible in American society, especially Blacks migrating north for better jobs, the so-called migration, Great Migration of the 20s. In its revived form, the Klan was not just anti-Black, however, it was based on local prejudices. For example, Klan chapters, depending on where they were, might target immigrants, Mexican Americans, Catholics, Jews, even drunks and philanderers were denounced for undermining the country's moral fiber. The Klan thrived on insecurity and nostalgia, appealed to men and women, rich and poor, farmers, city folk, including the governor of Indiana, who was a member in the 20s. People would join the Klan just like they would join any other respectable club in the community. On the right is an advertisement for a rally in North York, Pennsylvania, a Klan rally featuring fireworks, male quartets, choruses, quite a festive event. Admission and parking free. Now, when it came to violence, often associated with the Klan, tarring, feathering, other sorts of actions like that were quite rare. Usually burning crosses, harassing people, ostracizing them socially. Usually that was enough to bring the enemies of the Klan into line. Membership peaked at 4 million in 1924, and soon afterwards, corruption scandals, internal leadership fights, and a series of sexual assault indictments brought a swift decline to the Klan. Until the 1950s, sadly, we saw a second revival of the Klan begin, but nowhere near its earlier strength. On the federal level, the government took a major step toward legislating morality by enacting prohibition, the noble experiment. Constitutional amendment banning the production and sale of alcohol. After many decades of agitation and lobbying by temperance movements across the country. Unfortunately, when alcohol became illegal, it also became more glamorous. And it seems like people wanted to drink even more. Foreign ships loaded with booze lined the East Coast. Smugglers would send speedboats out to meet them. Thirsty customers could stash their illicit drink in a garter flask, like the one shown on the left, where they might hide them in false books or hot water bottles hidden under their clothes. Here's one I love. Drugstores during Prohibition sold kits of dried grapes and yeast for making, quote, grape juice. The instructions warned, quote, do not place liquid in jug and set aside for 21 days because it will turn into wine. Heaven forbid. Even the senator from Texas who wrote the 18th Amendment bringing about Prohibition couldn't resist the temptation. After Prohibition took effect, authorities found a whiskey still operating on his farm. Well, as I said, Prohibition never stopped Americans from drinking, just made it more exciting and drove it underground, leaving most of the production and distribution of alcohol in the hands of organized crime. Probably the most successful crime boss of the 20s was Al Capone, shown there on the left on his yacht off the coast of Florida. Shows him at his most benign as a modern businessman, A guy who donated money to soup kitchens bought ice cream for kids. He claimed, quote, "Public service is my motto." But he also allegedly said, "You get a lot further with a smile and a gun than you can with just a smile." At the peak of his career, Capone's organization ran dozens of clandestine breweries in Chicago, controlled 11,000 speakeasies, paid millions of dollars in bribes, and murdered 400 people a year. The most notorious killing was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 1929, reenacted on the right in a photograph for the Chicago Press. 4 of Capone's henchmen, disguised as cops, killed 7 rivals from the Bugs Moran gang. There were no witnesses. The perpetrators never came to trial, and neither did Al Capone, at least for gang-related mayhem. In 1931, he was convicted of income tax evasion. After 8 years in prison, he died of complications from syphilis. So for him, at least, crime did not pay. But playing the stock market did pay for a few Americans. As the prosperity of the 1920s went on, a mania of stock speculation took hold. With margin accounts, people could buy stocks for as little as 10% down. If stock prices kept going up, and why wouldn't they? They'd always have enough assets to cover the loans. But the stock boom masked some underlying problems with the American economy: growing consumer debt, slowdown in industrial production, unregulated banks and investment dealers, stagnant income among many working class Americans, and an excess concentration of wealth at the top. Running for election in late 1928, Herbert Hoover said the U.S. is, quote, "closer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." New York's Journal of Commerce had a different view in 1928. Quote, "It is perfectly well recognized by insiders that a market of the kind that has been going on cannot last indefinitely, but must undergo a readjustment." Well, 1 year later, the readjustment came, and then some. The stock market crash brought the Roaring Twenties to a painful end. Nervous investors began cashing out of the market in mid-October of 1929. On Black Monday, October 28th, selling pressure forced the Dow Jones average down 13%. Panic selling peaked the next day. Stocks were down another 12%. This was the worst 2-day decline in the history of the Dow Jones average. The market continued to slide through the end of the year. As personal and corporate wealth evaporated, the collapse triggered layoffs, bankruptcies, bank closings. But as far as we know, nobody ever actually jumped out of their office windows on Wall Street. By nature conservative, Hoover, in office at that time, resisted any direct federal intervention in the crisis until too late. Historians conclude that although the stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression, it was one symptom of a broader economic malaise affecting not only the US, but the whole world. That's a story for another day. Meanwhile, I want to close with a reminder that while the party lasted, Americans had fun. A wonderful video I found on YouTube set to the tune of Hot Feet. And you'll notice the editor of this piece very cleverly has synchronized dance movements to the beat of the music. So there's a bit of trickery involved, but it's quite fun. And it's a little hard to hear the dour gentleman who opens the video, but he says, "What a wonderful age we live in." I think you'll agree. Get out those dancing shoes.
What a marvelous age we live in.
Heartbeat, poor man's griddle. Heartbeat, sizzling soup. Oh, what will I do? I can bop bop bop. Heartbeat, heartbeat, stinging like a busy bee. Heartbeat, drop beat, smoke like a chimney. Hot heat, burn terribly, nearly makes a furnace out of me. Heartbeat, and I want to be hot, 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 hot. White heat, that's the way they have got. No, no, no. Heartbeat, heartbeat, Charleston's dune. Heartbeat, shot beat, black bottom ruined him. Heartbeat, hear him yell, oh, what's so hot heat?